So in my previous video, we found out why it's a bad idea to store salt water inside your engine. After some stern persuasion, I was able to get the piston out of the cylinder, but unfortunately, it left a good mark on the cylinder. I was hoping to reuse these pistons, but I may have persuaded a little bit too hard and cracked a piston. Moving on, I have to take apart the crankshaft so I can replace this oil seal. Taking off the stator assembly, which is basically the same thing as an alternator on a car. Yeah, I struggled a bit trying to take off the output shaft holding on the magneto flywheel. Don't always need the most expensive tools to get the job done. This is just a cheap, basically Harbor Freight puller. So I can take off the magneto. Sadly, I don't have any good machine shops around me, so I had to spend the money and get a new cylinder from Kawasaki. So my model year for the jet ski I have got superseded for the part, the cylinder got replaced by one that did not have the crankcase drain pre-drilled. So that's just what I'm doing here, is drilling it out. Giving the cylinder a good wash so I can get it ready for install. Going to be installing new pistons, so I got to take the old ones off and get the connecting rods ready for the new ones. The wrist pin was a little bit stuck, so I'm just using a socket to basically tap it out. These really shouldn't be pressed in or anything, so they're most of the time you can push them out with your fingers, but a little bit of extra persuasion is sometimes needed. Oops. Bearings really aren't that bad. They just have some light score marks. Can't feel it with my fingernail or anything, but since I'm in here, everything's getting new bearings and rebuilding everything. I paid just under 60 bucks each for these pistons shipped from Taiwan, and I think they're pretty good. Really, you just inspect parts and make sure everything fits nice and there's no obvious defects, and you can get away with saving a bit of money here and there. I ended up piecing out a lot of the rebuild parts or the new stuff that I ordered, either through SBT, some of the local watercraft places where I live, and eBay. And measuring out everything is kind of hit or miss. The rings are from SBT, and they actually spec'd out close enough where I didn't need to file them or anything. So most stuff came out pretty well within spec, or close enough where I wasn't worried about it. We gave the top half of the crankcase a good wash. A little bit of assembly lube before installing the pistons. Where I'm setting up the piston rings and orienting them according to the Kawasaki manual. None of this stuff needs to be like super exact. It's more of a guidelines. This oil ring was a bit too long. I was having a terrible time trying to fit it, so I just reused the old one and lube everything up, and it'll all pop right into place. I didn't even want to bother trying to follow the Kawasaki manual with fitting the cylinder over the pistons when I can just as easily install them using the piston ring compressor. Much easier this way. Here I'm pulling out all of the main bearings that support the crankshaft. None of them were in rough shape at all, but since I'm in here and everything's getting replaced, they're getting replaced. You can see it's pretty light wear on it. None of this would be an issue. You could run with those, but since I'm in here, it's all getting new. There's going to be a lot of mixed opinions on whether or not to lube the backside of a bearing. In my opinion, everything's going to get oil inside the engine, so it's getting oil. So that's how I'm building it. This is the new thrust bearing versus the old. You can see the old one doesn't really have much wear at all, which is a good sign. So nothing was really worn out on the bottom end. So this just gets a light coating of oil on the inside of the center main bearing, and the crankshaft will hold this in place. Nothing too complicated about this engine. It's fairly simple when you get down to it, and I think installing this and building it all from the bottom up is actually a much easier way to get this all sorted. You can see the thrust bearing being held in place by the crankshaft there. Just checking to make sure everything rotates freely, no bearings are binding, and it all flows smoothly. Kawasaki very clearly states, don't reuse connecting rod bolts. So, yeah, that's what I did. Very important O-ring and dowel for the oil. Installing the crankshaft oil seal. Using some gasket maker. You can use a Kawasaki brand or any generic. I just basically used RTV gray and installed the bottom case half. I'm installing all of the case bolts, main cap bolts, whatever, and lubing the heads just so I can prevent any binding as I torque them down. Kawasaki has a really nice way of identifying torque sequence. They label it for you, so they put numbers on the case so you know how to torque it down in sequence. Putting some grease on the crankshaft oil seal, making sure the keyway's in, and installing the flywheel magneto. Putting some assembly lube on the output shaft just to make sure it doesn't bind as I torque it down. Installing the starter bendix, which is how the starter connects to the flywheel and spins in one direction. Gotta take apart the oil pump and see what it looks like inside. And yeah, pretty nasty. So cleaning this up just to make sure I don't have any oil lubrication issues, because that would not be good. Oil pump gets a nice coating of assembly lube just to protect during startup. Installing a new O-ring with some grease on the stator housing just to make sure it's sealed if any water does get inside the hull. This can be a little bit tricky to line up because the magneto is magnetized, so it's going to suck it in hard, and you got to line up that starter bendix into the stator housing, and it's a little bit of a press fit too, so got to tap it all into place. I got the old oil cooler in the sandblasting cabinet just to see how bad it really is. And you can see it's pitted pretty hard. So I ended up buying a used one off of eBay just to replace it with something that's in better shape. This supposedly came from a freshwater one, and yeah, it's in pretty good shape. So definitely gonna put this on instead of the old one. So this oil pump and oiling system is sort of a semi-dry sump, and by that I mean the oil pump is submerged in oil, and instead of having a pickup, so it helps prevent loss of oil pressure when you're thrashing hard in the ski. With the oil pan finally installed, the short block is complete. Now I can move on to the cylinder head. Here I'm just using a socket and a hammer. Give a light tap over the valve keepers, and it forces that valve keeper retainer down, and the keepers will pop out. So a nice, quick, easy way instead of using a valve spring compressor. Intake valves are really pitted, so yeah, this head has definitely seen some better days, but I'll see what I can work with and see how good we can make it. With the exception of the intake valves, I'll be reusing most of this, so staying organized. Pulling out the valve seals, because these are all going to get replaced with new ones. Tearing down the rest of the head just so I can get everything clean. Now, before anyone comes at me, this is solely just to remove the gasket material and the residual stuff that's left stuck to the head. This won't remove hardly any material at all, and flatness will be measured after all this is done, so it'll be alright. You can see some more saltwater residue along with some oil vapor caked on in the intake runners. I'm going to use a 120 grit cartridge roll, try to get rid of a lot of this, and maybe even go a little bit extra, smooth out some of these old casting marks, and maybe make it just a little bit better than factory. And just a little bit of work later, and they cleaned up pretty nice. It's been a little bit taking these casting marks down, trying to smooth it all out. And these intake runners cleaned up pretty well. Probably won't notice much of a difference, but every little bit can help. Made sure to scrub the head really clean and clean those valve guides so I can lap these valves in and hopefully get a good seal. What I'm looking for is a nice dull finish right in the middle of that valve face so that it seats nice and smooth all the way around, concentric. Hopefully got no leaks. Using a flat surface and some sandpaper, I'm just smoothing out that head sealing surface to make sure it's nice and flat. You can see the limit here is 0.05, come in just under that, so that's within spec, so this should seal fine. Putting some assembly lube on the valve stems, installing the valve seals, spring plate, and inner and outer springs, and getting all of the valves reinstalled in the head. Valve keepers can be kind of annoying to install, but just be patient. It's, maybe some tweezers and hold them in place as you release tension and they should stay in. I'm getting ready to test my work, so I'm just filling all of the combustion cavities with water. I'm going to use compressed air to see if I can see any leaks around the valve seal. And a little bit, so see if I can't make this better. Also keep in mind, using compressed air on the intake side of the valves is kind of a harsh test. You got combustion pressure actually pushing against the valve, so they would be sealing the opposite direction. So basically, if you see some air leaks around the valves, it's actually probably okay. But since I'm in here already, I want to see if I can make it even better. So I bought a cheap valve seat cutter kit off Amazon. So I'm going to see if I can cut in some new valve seat faces, hopefully get it to seal a little bit better. So the valve itself is actually going to seal on a 45 degree with the different angles. In this case, with this seat cutter set, I have a 30-degree cutter, a 45, and a 60 degree. So the other angles smooth the transition to that 45 and it'll create less turbulence for the airflow going in and out of the cylinder. Well, since that didn't work, I guess I will remove these valve seats and try again. Basically what I'm doing here is welding on the stainless steel valve seat, and as I do that I'm going to build up a nice bead. The seat is going to heat up, and when it cools down it'll shrink just a tiny bit and I'll be able to punch it out. Hey, never said I was a professional welder, and it's my first time welding stainless. Yeah, I'm doing my best to hammer in the new valve seat. I want to make sure that there's no gaps so that I can machine it in and get it seated properly. If you look closely here, you can see I'm cutting away more material on the left side than the right. That's basically a good indication that the valve seat is not centered in comparison to the valve guide. So it just means I'm going to have to cut a lot of material out and hopefully it will still seal.
2 hours later.
Using the 45 degree to cut most of the seat, then I'll go back with the 60 degree and 30 degree to decrease the width of the seating surface to spec, which is represented by E in the diagram. Using a new exhaust valve, I'm going to use some grinding compound along with the die to see where the sealing surface is on the face of the valve, and I'm going to adjust with the cutters as I needed. As you can see right here, the gray area represents where the valve grinding compound is hitting, so I got to continue cutting because I want that gray area to be right in the middle of the valve face. Sadly, cheap tools in this case don't really work. These are dulling out incredibly fast, especially against the hardened seats, so do my best to machine them in, but it's not looking good so far. Another thing to consider as I keep taking off material here, the valve is going to continue to sink further into the head, which will result in lower spring pressure, which means the valves have a higher tendency to float at higher RPMs. Well, the valve seating surface is where I want, but the big problem here is the valve seats have a bunch of low spots in them, so these cutters aren't going to work for me. So I'm going to have to save up and get some nice ones. Putting that head aside, I'm going to try and use one that's in better shape. After lapping in the intake valves, it looks like the seating surface is in a really good spot, so hopefully these seal well. I used some sandpaper to clean up this cylinder deck surface as well. Even though it looks like it's leaking here, I am using about 90 psi of air, so it's a bit harsh to test these exhaust valves. So even though it's got a small leak, it actually still should run just fine. Installing the oil passage tube and the cylinder head dowels. Just like the crankcase, the cylinder head is numbered to show you the torque sequence. Starting with the chain guides, then chain and camshafts, I'll show an easy way to set up the timing. Here I'm just removing all the spark plugs so I can turn the engine over by hand a lot easier. I'm going to use that pen as a marker to get it to top dead center on cylinders 1 and 4. You can see I'm at top dead center is indicated by the timing plate here, the T, and then the 1.4 indicating top dead center for cylinders 1 and 4. More assembly lube everywhere. Installing the valve shims and the buckets. There are two dowels for the camshaft cap here and here. At this point, I have the chain pulled tight on the exhaust cam with its mark parallel to the cylinder head surface. Then I'll count 31 pins from that mark over to the intake cam mark and make sure it's also parallel with the cylinder head. Loosely install a few camshaft cap bolts and then install the chain tensioner. This will make sure the teeth don't jump from their marks and you can slowly tighten down the cap with even pressure. Double check all of the marks line up and then give the engine a few rotations and it should be good to go. I'm checking valve lash, which is the space between the bottom of the camshaft lobe and the valve bucket. Too much space and the valve won't fully open, and too little and the valve could not seal as everything expands due to operating temperature. Just installing the starter. This is the oil drain from the cylinder to the oil pan. This is the crankshaft sensor. It counts the teeth on the crankshaft wheel there, and combining with the camshaft sensor, it's what tells the computer when to fire injectors and spark plugs. Installing the crankcase breather box. This collects oil vapor and returns it to the oil pan. Putting it in the exhaust manifold. Engine went in pretty easy, but I had to remove that front left engine mount. I got the engine slightly tilted so I could slip it into the coupler for the jet pump. Now I just need to install the 4 engine mount bolts. Now I gotta add oil and turn the engine over to make sure I got oil pressure. Compression number's not bad, but hopefully they go after a bit of run time and everything seats in. Here I'm just cleaning up the reed valves. This is an emissions device. It mixes air into the exhaust. I just want to get all the saltwater corrosion out of everywhere I can, just to minimize any issues I'm going to have in the future. Installing the valve cover gasket with a little bit of silicone, and I'll put on the seals for the spark plug holes. Now I just need to hook up all the cooling hoses. An easy thing to remember for the cooling system is you have high pressure coming from the jet pump supplying cold water to the engine and everything, and anything going to the exhaust is low pressure and is heated water or whatever leaving the engine. Got the intake manifold cover off. Get some of this salt water residue out of here. It's just crystallized salt from the sea air. Get all that cleaned out so it doesn't go through the engine. installing the intake manifold and then the oil catch can. And for the final touch, hooking up the spark plug wires.
Me voy a matar, este es mi último. Uy. 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 Me voy a matar, este es mi último. Uy. 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 Uy.
Hope you found this informative. Thanks for watching.